In olden days, a glimpse of stocking was looked on as something shocking. Now heaven knows anything goes. Good on these toes.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to a brand new program here on Westfield Community Programming Channel 15 and 89.5 FM WSKB. It's called On the Mark. I'm your host, Mark Auerbach, and we'll be chatting over the course of this series, which will be running every Wednesday morning, with people around and about on a variety of different topics. And today we launch the series talking about stories and storytelling. And over the years, we've all been fixed to things like medical stories like Dr. Kildare or Grey's Anatomy or St. Elsewhere. And we've read books of, like Death Be Not Proud about people overcoming medical obstacles, doctors and nurses who are heroes and heroines, and people who have a story to tell about medicine, survival, compassion, caring, and first responders. So on our very first show, we're going to be talking with a memoirist who chronicled the life of his partner and being a caregiver to his partner who was dying from a brain tumor. We'll be talking with an author who is an author in residence at Bay Path University, who is starting a medical narrative program. And in the final segment of the program, a writer who does medical research for the podcast series Game Changers in Medicine, which tells about the backstories behind medicines and medical discoveries that happen by serendipity. But our first guest this morning is James Homan. He's the author of the memoir Out Here in the Stars. He and I spent an hour together talking on ArtsBeat, and if you're interested in catching that interview, you can certainly find it on WSKB Community Radio's YouTube page. But James Homan's back in the studio to talk about the medical narrative and how he came to write this memoir. It's good to see you again.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. It's good to be here. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, it's really great. I've read the memoir, and we spent an hour talking about it. And it's basically, let me see if I can summarize this, the story of two men in love in the 80s in New York City, and one partner develops brain cancer, very similar to that John McCain had or Teddy Kennedy had. It's incurable, and you, as the caregiver, took care of him through this entire process. Unfortunately, he didn't survive it. And then you wrote this memoir about it. And I want to first ask you, when did you decide to write this story?
Well, actually, it was at his memorial service when his former therapist was leaving, and she embraced me and said, "This needs to be written. I hope you'll do it." And I had never really considered that. But it was such an incredible experience and filled with such irony and absurdities and really positive experiences along the way that I thought, why not? We were originally given a diagnosis or prognosis of 3 months. He had 3 months to live, and he died 1 week short of what would have been his 15th month. So we got a full 14 months to say goodbye.
When you decided to write it, I know that you had kept copious notes throughout his entire process of treatments with the doctors and the therapists and all of that, and you wrote down everything. Partially because as a caregiver, you do that. You make sure that every dosage that's prescribed is written down. But how long did it take you to transcribe all of that into a memoir?
Almost 20 years. You're right. I think in today's age, everybody's health should be monitored. And I'm not sure that in some situations, like terminal diagnoses, that you can expect the caregiver to really monitor that. Also, Harold's father had been the family practitioner in Mountainside, New Jersey. So his family was steeped in a medical background. His uncles were physicians as well as his father. So I realized if I didn't have these names correct or the spelling correct or whatever, that it was going to be a little bit embarrassing because they were on top of it. His father was not living when this happened to him, but I just knew that I was in a medical family and they would want to know things accurately. I wrote things down. I encourage caregivers to ask questions. There is never a stupid question. When you don't know how to spell thalidomide, glioblastoma, you ask, you really ask. And I had about 8 steno books of notes from 14 months and almost a ream of paper printouts that I'd gotten, emails from friends, suggestions, research, various things like that. So I took all of that to a memoir writing seminar in Tuscany and for a week tried to write this in 2000. And I couldn't get through it. It was too soon. I would be reduced to tears. And so it took a while. I also had a period where all the papers just sat in a box on the floor in the back of a closet because I just couldn't. I didn't have time. I was working full time. I'm raising a 75-year-old, so that takes a lot of time.
Of course.
Yes. And anyway, I didn't have time, and so when I finally retired, I got back to it, and it was published last August.
Did you have an editor working with you through the course of it? How did you decide what to keep in and what to save for another book?
Well, I didn't have an editor, and as I began writing it, it became more about me, which is not what I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be about Harold and about this illness, and I wanted the literature to be added to the LGBTQTIA, whatever, history in the universe, and without an editor, I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what form it was taking or what shape it was taking. I would register for classes to find out more about character development and line and narrative and things like that, which all helped. But it wasn't until Bob, my partner, actually got involved and said, let me read some. He said, I think I can help you with this. So he actually pulled 5 chapters from the original manuscript and condensed the book. So I think of it as a circle that needed to be completed. I think of that relationship as needing to be completed. I think of the book as having needed to be completed. So I finished it finally, and I've gotten some wonderful response.
Well, I found the book overwhelming to read. As I had said in the previous time that we chatted, our lives have paralleled each other over the years. We were involved in the same Broadway production of Hello, Dolly. We lived in the same neighborhood of New York. We went to the same restaurants, the same clubs, the same parties. And we didn't know each other until Patrick Berry at the Westfield News introduced us a couple of years ago. But as I was reading it, it's more than just a recap of a really great relationship that you had with your partner or a description of what it's like to be a caregiver, but it makes everybody think that if you do love somebody and you do care for them and something monumental happens and you're put in the position of having to be their spokesperson, their advocate, and everything else, that it's a role that you were never planning to play, and it's thrust upon you, and you either rise to the occasion or you falter. But you were able to rise to that occasion and move forward. What are some of the things, if you could tell somebody who is put in a similar situation where a partner, spouse, friend comes down with some horrific illness, whether it's COVID or it's cancer like that you dealt with, what are the things you need to do to be a good caregiver?
Well, get organized, for one thing. Ask questions. The medical staff that you're dealing with will never be offended by any of your questions. Write it down if you can't remember it. Don't rely on the patient to recall details very specifically at all. The patient is shocked. Another thing is to anticipate change. Change happens, anticipate it. What might be a course of medication or treatment one day may change the next day. So get flexible, be flexible. Organize the home so that we had to staple down throw rugs, for example. We put bars in the shower, in the bathtub in the shower. We had to do things like that. What else? Recognize also that there will be a shift in this course of care, and that shift will go from your attention 250% being on the patient. Suddenly the attention will shift to the caregiver, only because if anything happened to that caregiver, that terminally ill patient would be SOL. And so there's a shift that takes place. Don't feel badly about that. It's not a selfish thing. It's not an egocentric thing. It's just something that happens. And be kind to yourself. Good luck. It's not unlike having a baby. I hear from new mothers that, when the baby's sick and they roll over in another room, the mother wakes up instantly. It's very similar to that.
Yeah.
Even though the hospital bed might be in your bedroom and you're sleeping next to it, sometimes I had to move him every 2 hours. So I had to get up every 2 hours. And a complete REM cycle is 3 to 4 hours. So you never really get a complete REM cycle rest.
Indeed.
So,
did you find closure from this experience in writing the memoir? Did it kind of, is now this entire experience that you had with your partner in the past so that you can move on? Did writing help you with that?
very definitely it helped. When Harold died, his brain surgeon from Mount Sinai called me to express his condolences. And he said, James, we've never worked with a caregiver who was as intricately involved as you were in this. And I just want to compliment you on the care and the love. And I said, well, it didn't make any difference, did it? And he said, oh, never think that.
Yeah.
It made all the difference in the world to Harold. So that was my unclosure, my feeling that it didn't make any difference, and that regardless of what I did or how well I did it, but writing the book helped me put it in another perspective. And I'm hoping, I have a friend in the divinity school at Harvard, and she's getting her degree in hospice care. So I sent her this book, and she said, oh my God, it definitely should be a part of all hospice concepts, Anyway.
Do you have another book inside that you're thinking about?
Actually, I took the 5 chapters that Bob had extracted, and I used it as a base and added some other stories from my life. So I call it a collection of reflections. It's called Reverie Alone Will Do. And it's just reflections on my life from various periods of my life, including when I was a toddler. My very first memory. So that it starts with that, and it ends with my how I tend to see the world and how I tend to see this society from the 40s when I was born up until today. And we're the boomers. So here I sit in my final stage waiting for the final boom.
I'm sure when that happens, the entire world will hear it. Let me ask you, as you're writing now, and you're writing book number 2, are you turning to editors, or will you self-publish this book, or how do you expect it to get out there?
Well, although I've had really positive experiences from editors, publishers, literary agents, etc., they considered it so raw. They were quite surprised at how raw this material is. But of course, I'm 73, and they're not interested in the fact that I have no or very limited future. So they were reluctant to pick any of this up. So I'm not working with anyone other than my current spouse, Bob Plass, and and anyway, that's the way it's going. I have to self-publish. So I'm publishing through Barnes & Noble Press.
Okay, so where's Out Here in the Stars available right now?
It is currently available in the hard copy edition. It's a second edition now, and it's available on BarnesandNoblePress.com. And then it's also available as Kindle for, I think it's $9.95, and Kindle also has a paperback version for $14.95 that you can order, online through Kindle. So you can see these things anyway. Research it.
Yeah. And when do you expect the next book to come out?
Actually, I just did that last night. So anyway, I'm hesitant to tell people. But anyway, it's out there. It's in the final review process for Barnes & Noble, but it should be available on Barnes & Noble very soon.
Now that you've become a writer, how would you encourage other people that have gone through the caregiving experience or want to express themselves about a triumph or a tragedy? How would you advise them to start? Do you just sit there and recap things? Did you use a tape recorder? Did you write it longhand? Did you type it? How did you start?
Well, I started writing longhand, and I really encourage that because I think there's something about the mental process, traveling from one's brain to one's fingers, and then seeing it on the page is pretty exciting. But I would say write what you know. I'm astonished. I don't know if you know the writer Richard Powers, but I've just read 2 overwhelmingly impressive books that he has written. One is called The Overstory, and the other is called The Time of Our Singing, which it flabbergasts me. His intelligence is so extraordinary. But he writes about things that I don't know that he's ever experienced. I mean, who can experience living in a tree for 6 months, as a tree hugger in Northern California? Maybe he did that. I don't know. But he writes from a very interesting perspective. And I'm astonished to think that if he hasn't experienced it, how has he written so beautifully about it? So I don't know. I was always told to write what you know, and so you're gonna know me better than you've ever wanted to.
So do you have another couple of books in mind, or they're floating around up there in your head of things that you'd, given time and energy, would like to do?
Yes, I've tried a little fantasy thing, sci-fi kind of thing about Anyway, but I don't want to talk about that too much. I don't really know that I have any more stories in me. You know, if I do, I'll write them down. Sometimes it wakes me up at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, and I'll just go to the computer and start typing out things. But I don't know that I have any more books in me.
You never know, James.
You don't know.
Anyway, the book is called Out Here in the Stars, available online. We had a great interview on my other program, Arts Beat TV and Radio, which is archived on YouTube on the WSKB Community Radio page. So we're going to take a break. We want to thank James Homan, the author and memoirist, for joining me on this premiere edition. We're going to take a quick break to acknowledge the underwriters that make community television and radio possible here. And then we'll be back with Suzanne Strempek Shea, the author who is a author and writer in residence at Bay Path University. This is On the Mark, and this is on Westfield Community Programming Channel 15, 89.5 FM WSKB. Peter Coles is our chief engineer, and we'll be back after we acknowledge the underwriters of this program, so don't go away.
Support for community radio on WSKB provided by Westfield Electroplating. Employing over 140 skilled platers, painters, and technicians, Westfield Electroplating was founded in 1946 and was the first company in the country to achieve National Aerospace and Defense Contractor Program accreditation, proudly maintaining that status for over a decade. Westfield Electroplating provides over 50 quality finishes to meet your corrosion, cosmetic, or performance needs. On the web at www.westfieldplating.com or 413-568-3716. Westfield Electroplating, putting the finishing touches on technology.
Underwriting for community radio is provided by the YMCA of Greater Westfield. Every day, the YMCA strengthens the community through programs and services focused on youth development, healthy living, and social responsibility. For all the Y's many programs and services, visit us on the web at www.westfieldymca.org. The YMCA, 67 Court Street in downtown Westfield. We're more than a gym. We're a cause.
It's Tuesday morning from 6 till 8. Wow, it's Tuesday with Bob Plass.
Community Radio
89.5 WSKB.
Live from Studio 120 at Westfield Technical Academy, this is WCPC Channel 15 at 89.5 FM WSKB Westfield.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Mark Auerbach, your host of a new program here on Westfield Community Programming Channel 15 and 89.5 FM WSKB. It's called On the Mark. We're talking today about writing medical narratives, and our next guest is Suzanne Strempek Shea, who is a well-known novelist from Western Massachusetts, who is the writer in residence at Bay Path University in Longmeadow, and about to start a new program about writing medical narratives. Good morning, Suzanne.
Good morning, Mark. Thank you so much for having me on your program.
It's always a treat to get a chance to chat with you. And our first guest was James Homan, who is a memoirist who wrote a story about being a caregiver. And there's so many people right now writing about and transfixed by stories in the medical genre, whether it's Grey's Anatomy or John Gunther's Death Be Not Proud, and a whole variety of things. And you at Bay Path are starting a new program for writing about a medical narrative. Can you tell us about it?
Sure, definitely. I'm thrilled to. We're starting in January, and it is a 4-course program that will result in a certificate of narrative medicine, and that means that you have studied the art and craft and engaged in the practice of writing about medical and trauma narratives, the psychology of the sick, social justice narratives. You will have undergone an internship in a healthcare setting or other setting that to lead creative writing groups to foster the use of writing as a tool in the medical journey or just in your life journey in particular. It's in the wider way. This is anybody's story, but it certainly, this subgenre zeroes down into the effects of a personal jarring experience, trauma, a life-changing experience, sometimes of a let's say, an injury or an illness or a change in your community or a loss, the effects of grief, the effects of economic hardship, all that can go under this umbrella and result in some amazing work. And so I really am grateful for what James is writing about and others, just to really put us in the shoes of people who are going through things different than us, but we also might find solace and understanding from their stories.
And medical narrative has been such a part of our culture. I mean, when you turn on television, ever since we were kids, there was always a medical series, whether it was St. Elsewhere's or Dr. Kildare, Ben Casey, ER, Grey's Anatomy, Chicago Hope. People are transfixed, it seems, by the stories of people that are captured by illness or surgery or accidents and ultimately recover or don't, and doctors and nurses that are heroes and heroines and things like that. If somebody has had had an experience as a caregiver or has survived a trauma, either medical trauma or an accident or something like that, how do you advise them to pull their thoughts together to write that story?
Well, I think first just to realize that it might be more difficult than they think. Sometimes people will say, well, I'm just going to write about that day that, I fell and this happened and then I had to go for help and all this. But, sometimes there are other things that come into it that we don't even expect. So, kind of gird yourself that it's going to be maybe a more difficult journey psychologically. So I always like to just tell people to be easy on themselves as they enter a story like this. Certainly read pieces. It doesn't have to be on your particular experience, but read pieces that talk about the healing process, the process of going through a hardship. Something like a book like Melanie Brooks's Writing Hard Stories, which is 18 interviews with memoirists who have approached their own hard stories, gives you insight into 18 different writers' looks at what that process is like and the walls they came up against and how they overcame them and the fears that I think we all share in the writing process. But if you're writing your own story, just do it little by little. I have to me my book of favorite books here, and I Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, and that's more or less a book about writing fiction, although I've used it in all sorts of writing courses. And she just says, little by little, if you can't do 2 pages a day, do 2 paragraphs a day, do 2 lines a day, and that really puts you that much more ahead than you would have been if you hadn't done anything. And also that little by little approach is good when you're approaching those hard stories, that just do a little bit and then, congratulate yourself that you went that much farther into it. And you don't have to throw it all down at once. Take your time and just see where the story leads you, and you might be amazed.
Now, you've been a writer for a long time. You've written a variety of genres. I think you're best known perhaps as a novelist. Do you sit there and write on longhand on paper? Do you sit in front of a word processor or a computer? Do you dictate with speak text or something like that? How do you actually put your thoughts and words on paper?
Thanks, Mark. Yes, I heard James answering this question, and everybody's different. I come from the background of loving to type in the first place. When I learned at Palmer High School, I just couldn't believe what a cool thing it was to do, just to hit these keys and, just create words. And I love the sound and the feel of it. And I just never really was someone, I wrote part of one book longhand only because I had a friend of mine, Roland Marullo, who's a writer in Williamsburg, Mass., was talking about writing longhand on legal pads. And I said, I'm going to try this out, but I think I think faster and better when I'm typing. And that partially is too, I was a newspaper reporter for about 15 years. And that was, you rush back from some scene of something or some meeting or some event, and you just, you're just going to sit there and be typing away. I just love that activity. So that's what I do, and it's every day. I write in the morning till The Young and the Restless comes on, and I have my lunch with the people in Genoa City. and then I do some more work in the afternoon. But yeah, I've written novels and nonfiction, and it's my nonfiction really that got me into the narrative medicine track, because that's when I was diagnosed with breast cancer about actually 20 years ago at this time. I was going through treatment, and I kept a journal, and that became my first book of narrative medicine. So it was sort of unexpected, but I'm really happy that it was one of the good parts of that experience.
When you transformed your personal experience and wrote the narrative, how long after you went through this did you actually sit down to write it?
Well, I would come home each day from radiation therapy at Bay State, which is about half an hour from me here in Bondsville, and I would write for about a half an hour before I talked to my husband Tommy or did anything else. I just felt like I needed to get that out of myself. And I'm not a journal keeper. I never have been, but it was just something that I wanted to do. And when I was done with that 6.5-week course of radiation, I thought, we'd have a little party with our friends who had been so supportive, and we were going to have a bonfire and burn the pages. But my friends took a look at them, and Tommy did, and they were all very encouraging that maybe I should get the story out there, and I think for your listeners who are interested in not only telling their story, but what it can do for others, is that your story might be the key for someone's understanding, because I didn't know anything about radiation therapy, and I went to Palmer Library, put in the search engine radiation, and I got books on Hiroshima and Chernobyl and medical radiation. And I wanted sort of a guidebook, like if I'm going to go to the Cape, I want to know where to eat and where to go and what roads to, that are going to be better or prettier and all this. I wanted somebody to tell me what radiation was going to be like. And when my friends and Tommy encouraged me to present these pages to my agent, I said, well, maybe that could be that for somebody. And so think about what your experience can be for somebody else. And maybe it's not going to be the exact same experience they're going through, but they're going to get something from how you approached it. In my case, I was like a crabby, depressed patient. And I've heard from people who said, I love hearing that, you weren't the Hallmark Channel patient, because I think, that's good if you can be like that. Not all of us are like that. And so you might be an example of, just be the thing that helps somebody understand what it's like to be in those shoes, if a loved one is going through something, or if it's you yourself, you might find a hand to hold.
Yeah, I mean, I had an accident a couple of years ago and went through some surgeries and a long recovery and rode back to learning to walk. And I thought about it, and my stereotypes had been watching Grey's Anatomy or reading medical things. So when I'm being wheeled into this operating room and the people are not as glamorous looking and the lighting isn't perfect, even though I'm in my pain and lying there, I'm going, well, this isn't what I expected or my stereotype. And I'm at the point now where I'm personally beginning to write about my experiences. It's almost 2 years after the fact, and I can think about them more clearly. But where I've gone back to is my Facebook posts, because every day during the course of my recovery, I would post something to Facebook, and I chronicled them. And I think ultimately down the road, there will be a story. But all of us that deal with writing, or all of us in our journalistic phases, think of going back with our experiences. I don't think it's a way of my coming to terms with myself as much as maybe one of the experiences I had might help somebody else who falls down a flight of stairs and breaks their legs. And so you think of it in those terms. What is it like, or what is the role of a writer in residence at a university?
Well, thank you for asking. I first want to say that I'm glad you're fine, and I'm glad you're working on writing regarding that, because some of our most jarring experiences that we go through are the unexpected ones, the unexpected loss or the unexpected,
I agree, but unlike you as a writer, I'm primarily a radio person, so I have speak text installed in my laptop, and I'm actually talking to my computer, and then going back, and the writer in me goes back and edits what I just spoke at Random Thoughts into a MacBook.
Nifty. Wow. Well, I might have to try that.
It's
But,
it's
yeah,
certainly
thank you.
easy.
Yeah.
I mean, you can hold a cup of coffee and talk at the same time and get those words on the screen.
Ooh, that's tempting. Yeah, I could do it on my walk, but yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I'll
What
take
does
that
a
to try.
what does a writer in residence do, or what is your role at Bay Path?
Well, basically, she gets to have kind of dream work in that she hopes to that she's doing things that further the interest in reading and writing in others. And I was fortunate to have the enthusiasm of former Bay Path President Carol Leary. We now have a new president, Sandra Doran, and she's a reader as well. And so, but Carol Leary was a reader of my books and very enthusiastic about ideas I brought to her about how Bay Path University might use writing to further women's education and also allow them to open up more about what they've been through, tell their own stories, tell stories about things that are important to them. And so we began expanding classes for undergrads in writing, and also along the way started, we created a Writer's Day, which normally goes twice a year in the spring and the fall. We're going to have one in November, actually, talking about writing through hard times, and that's November 12th, and that's all online. But normally we gather people for an afternoon of writing panels. So there's that part. There's an annual festival or an annual day in which newly published writers talk about their work, and that's for book clubs, and that's usually in the spring. We also, the job also entails inviting a visiting writer onto campus to visit classes and to present programs. And another thing is that we created an MFA in creative nonfiction, and that is a graduate program that is open to both males and females, people of actually any genre, as is our narrative medicine certificate. And it's another opportunity for furthering and deepening your writing experience and learning. And part of that is a week-long seminar that we do in Ireland. We were to have done our 6th annual writing week in Ireland in August, but of course this year we didn't. We're shooting for next August, and we have a variety of American authors who come over and Irish authors and poets, and we have a very intensive week gathered in the beautiful County Kerry village of Dingle. So it's a lot of just trying to offer people sometimes night courses. If you can't make a traditional course, come and try 4 Wednesday nights of writing, and just to see, dip your toe into it and see how much further this can take you if you're interested in it.
If people
So
are
I get to
interested,
help create all that.
if people are interested in the programs at Bay Path, how can they get more information?
They can always write me at shea@baypath.edu. They can also visit our baypath.edu site, and you can go on to /narrative medicine or MFA in creative nonfiction. Also, look, when you're on the site, look up our wonderful MFA director, Leanna James Blackwell, who is a playwright and nonfiction writer, and she's the guiding light of so many of these programs too, and I'm thrilled to work with her. So it's a wonderful experience, and I've been so excited about and proud of what's happening. Actually, one of our MFA graduates was published back in February, wrote a narrative about her diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, and that is Meredith O'Brien, who's a native of West Springfield, now lives out in Eastern Mass, teaches at Northeastern. But she wrote about, being a young mother who has a very life-altering diagnosis that so many people have, and approached it very personally, but also has sections in which she interviewed her children and her husband, and she talks about various other life challenges, as often happens when you're going through some sort of a a trauma, there's other things. Life is also going on in the background. So there's, all the things happening at once. And she just shows you how she navigated that. And I think she did a beautiful job. So she's one of our graduates, and we're seeing more and more people get published. We also now, through the program, through the MFA program, have a magazine called Multiplicity, and it's going to have a new issue out very soon on the subject of work. And we launched that magazine in the spring. And it's also got a blog, so we're inviting people to take a look. And if you've got something to contribute, please do.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Suzanne Strempek Shea, who is the writer in residence at Bay Path University. I hope a lot of you will go check out the website and consider the medical narrative program. We're going to acknowledge our underwriters when we're back. On the next segment of On the Mark, we'll be talking with Sharon Johnson, who is the researcher and writer for the new podcast series, Game Changers in Medicine. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Support for community radio on WSKB is provided by Betts Plumbing and Heating Supply Company, an independent, family-owned wholesaler serving Westfield for over 50 years, specializing in plumbing, heating, and industrial piping supplies. On the web at bettsplumbing.com or at 14 Coleman Avenue in Westfield.
Support for the community programming of WSKB is provided by Westfield Bank. For more than 160 years, Westfield Bank has been an important community presence and commercial leader in the Pioneer Valley. With convenient full banking services in Westfield, West Springfield, East Longmeadow, Agawam, Feeding Hills, Springfield, Southwick, as well as Enfield and Granby, Connecticut, visit us on the web at westfieldbank.org.
I'm Mark Auerbach. Join me every Friday at 8 a.m. for Arts Beat, where you'll meet interesting actors, directors, designers, and musicians here in Western New England.
Community Radio.
89.5 WSKB.
Live from Studio 120 at Westfield Technical Academy, this is WCPC Channel 15 and 89.5 FM, WSKB Westfield.
Welcome back to On the Mark, everyone. I'm Mark Auerbach, your host. Peter Coles is our chief engineer. We're broadcasting from Studio 120 at Westfield Technical Academy on Westfield Community Programming Channel 15 and 89.5 FM WSKB. Our third guest this morning, as we talk about medical narratives and writing, is Sharon Johnson, who is the writer for the new podcast series, Game Changers in Medicine. She's New England-based, has graduated from Wellesley, has written on a variety of narratives, fiction, nonfiction, and I believe this is her first podcast. Sharon, good morning.
Good morning, Mark. Nice to chat with you. And yes, this is Game Changers in Medicine is my first podcast.
It's mine as well. And I've got to say, out of transparency, that you're doing all the writing. We have a great team of producers, and I'm the lucky guy that gets to do the PR for it. But it's a fascinating series because instead of talking about medical tragedies or how people survived, it actually goes back in time and talks about how doctors and nurses and researchers oftentimes by accident discover these amazing therapies, from insulin to penicillin to x-rays to warfarin and stuff like that. How did you become a writer?
Well, it was not intentional. It's interesting as I do all this research on medicine and discoveries and how they often would happen accidentally. I would say maybe I'm an accidental writer. I always loved to write. I kept a journal since I was 16, but my original interest out of college was in real estate development, and I wrote a letter to the editor on some topic, and someone who was actually doing work at my home, my gardener, read it, and she asked me to help her with a writing project. And that was, 25 years ago. And honestly, from that one writing project, I kept getting referred. And my sweet spot seemed to be ghostwriting. And I think I was able to carve out a niche for myself there, because ghostwriting is more about listening and drawing the story out of someone. It's as much about that as it is about the writing. And I love that process because every time I get to ghostwrite, it feels like a privilege. It's helping somebody far more important than I am tell their story and share it with the world. And that's turned into an amazing career for me. I feel really, really lucky.
Explain what ghostwriting is. I mean, a lot of us that work in the business sort of know the term, but I wonder if all of our listeners do. So can you sort of explain what it is?
Sure. Ghostwriting is the invisible writer behind the story. Lots of people would be able to write their own story, but they're too busy, or they don't feel they have the voice, but they have an important story to tell. So my job, or any ghostwriter's job, is to interview them, read their papers, other things they may have written, and draft a narrative. And the way I work is I would always draft the narrative, drawing on not only the person whose story it is, but again, all of speaking to other people, trying to get to know this person as best I can, draft a narrative, and then give the person that narrative to respond to. Because it's easier to respond to something written than to write it from scratch. And with every client, what happens from there can be different. Sometimes that's all the client needs, and they say, great, I can take it from here and make it even more my own. Or with other clients, it will be a constant iteration, getting it to where they want it. Typically, my name is not typically I'm not given author credit, and I understand that going in. My satisfaction is really genuinely with the finished product. But in a few cases, like with Dr. Maloney, he featured in our first podcast on vitamin K. He was gracious enough to put me on the cover, and other clients have done the same. But as a ghostwriter, that you really expect to be invisible.
But you've also written a variety of things under your own byline, true?
Yes, that is true. When I am not busy writing for other people, which I really like, I enjoy writing kind of slice of life narrative stories and essays.
And your writing has not only been in when you've ghostwritten books for people that have either been fiction or nonfiction, but you've written for the Boston Globe and for other magazines and newspapers as well. Do you obviously like being a ghostwriter, but do you like writing in any genre in particular for a byline?
I really love feature writing, and the most fun I've had as a writer was years ago when I was doing more writing for Boston Magazine on design, interior design. And that's just a hobby of mine, and it's something I have a lot of interest in. I'm no good at it, but I enjoy good design. And that was so much fun because I would get to go into people's gorgeous homes and interview them and interview the interior designer. And that just felt like great fun.
One of the things I find kind of intriguing is that you're writing right now with Game Changers in Medicine. You're writing the backstories of these amazing medical discoveries, from insulin to warfarin or vitamin K. And, a lot of it is intricate detail. And I notice, there's a lot of medical facts. And when I get to see a script that you've written, it's got footnotes or a term paper. So that you've made sure that the research is complete and detailed and all of that. And then you can turn around and write something else that's completely different. When you're writing a podcast, how much detail do you actually put into the podcast, and how much goes into the backstory? Because you're writing for something to be listened to as opposed to be read.
Well, it's a great question, and I was smiling when you were describing all my different types of writing, and what came to my mind was this either means I'm very nimble or I lack focus. So it is one or the other. But to answer your question about writing the podcast, as I said, I'm learning as I go, and my hope is that in time I will become more efficient. But we air these podcasts monthly, each one per month, as you know, and each one is like, I feel like I'm boiling the ocean when I start, because there is so much information, and it's a lot of medical information, and I'm not medical by training. And it's the hardest part is finding the pathway through all of that. I want to be sure to be true to the science, which is why I document, and I only use approved sources, medical journals and National Institute of Health and .org sites and .gov sites.
But
go ahead.
I didn't want to interrupt you there. Keep going. You only go to recognized and approved sites.
Right. So that I need all of that science as the scaffolding. But what's interesting to me, and I hope is interesting to the audience, is it's the human story. It's so on the podcast on X-rays, which I think is airing on Wednesday, we learn about Röntgen, the 50-year-old physicist who beavers away in his basement lab night after night after night. He's sleeping there some nights. His wife, Bertha, has got to be completely annoyed with him because he's not coming up for dinner. She has to bring him his dinners down to the basement lab. And it's those details. Like, these were real people who stumbled onto something that was interesting, and they pursued it. What I'm learning and what really is inspiring me, and again, I hope, my hope is that this podcast will inspire people either to go into medicine or people who already are in medicine and slogging away to keep going, because we need them now more than ever. But what I find, what I'm really loving is with so many of these discoveries, like with X-ray, for example, X-rays were discovered before Röntgen officially discovered it in the late 1800s. But people they saw something interesting, but through their research, but they didn't follow up on it. They thought, wow, what is this weird light that's going on over here on these photographic plates I happen to have in my lab? And they'd return the photographic plates because they said they're defective. They weren't defective. They were discovering X-rays. They just didn't know it. They weren't curious enough to figure it out. And I'm seeing that with a lot of these discoveries. It's not just the initial moment. It's seeing something unusual, unexpected, different, and being curious enough and dogged and determined and stubborn enough to carry through and figure out the source. And I'm inspired by that, truly.
Yeah, I find the stories interesting. And the other thing that I find interesting is that you are writing them to be heard as opposed to be read. And
yes.
In the work that I do in radio, most of the scripting that I do is meant to be heard and not read. So it takes a little bit of a different skill set. Did you realize this as you were starting to write it, that your words would be spoken?
I did. I was fortunate in another iteration of my career was I handled corporate communications at Digitas in Boston for a bit over 3 years. And part of that great job was speech writing. And I remember the first time I was assigned a speech. I think it was for the CEO. I think it was for a keynote speech at a company that might have been called DoubleClick. It was a big deal. And I panicked because I'd never written a speech before, but I'm always game for anything. And I remember I went to the bookstore and bought a book by Peggy Noonan on speech writing. So I read the book and then I wrote the speech, and I loved it. And I realized that speech writing is more my natural voice, because in writing, my natural voice is pretty conversational. So now when I write the podcast, the first script I do, it's the ugly, messy script that no one will ever see. And it probably reads more like a term paper. But then when I feel like I have the facts down, when I feel like as though I have the narrative the way I want it to be, then I go back and rewrite for audio, and I read the whole thing aloud, and that helps. That's a good exercise for any type of writing, even not spoken writing. There's that great tool. I don't know to whom I should attribute it, but it's where you alter, and that served me well. But especially when writing for the podcast, I read it aloud, and now that I know Dr. Pillay, our amazing narrator and host, pretty well, I read it aloud with his voice in mind and his cadence in mind. So that's how I do it, and my hope is that with each episode I get a little better.
Well, we're running out of time, but Sharon, I just have to say I applaud the writing that you do. And people can hear Game Changers in Medicine on all of the podcast platforms. But if you want more information, it's gamechangersinmedicine.com. It's produced by Dramatic Health, whose CEO is Sean Maloney, who has appeared on 2 of my series in the past, Arts Beat and How We're Doing, which you can find archived editions on the WSKB Community Radio YouTube page. We've been chatting with Sharon Johnson, who is the writer for Game Changers in Medicine, who's got a great career as a features writer as well as a ghost writer. And this wraps up the very first edition of On the Mark. Sharon, thanks for joining us. We'll be back every Wednesday with a new edition here on WCPC Channel 15 and or 89.5 FM WSKB. I'm your host, Mark Auerbach. Peter Coles has been our chief engineer. We'll catch you next Wednesday.
Other people's stories, other people's lives, socialites and film stars cheating on their wives, debutantes in ball gowns, young and fancy-free, people on adventures, not me. Other people's intrigue, other people's sin. Why does David Niven live with Errol Flynn? Other people's secrets bursting to be told. Hotbeds of excitement, mine's cold. Jean Cocteau and Jean Marais have fallen out with Charles Trenet. Frank Sinatra's in Montmartre in a silver Chevrolet. And where is Greta Garbo? And who is Howard Hughes? It's other people's stories and other people's news. You won't find my story in a magazine. A young girl from a convent, all of 17. Then she had a suitor, his beard was turning gray. Imagine her reaction, dismay. Mother said, be grateful, you're not to make a fuss. Love will happen later, that's how it was for us. Mother said, he's wealthy, be glad of what you get. Love will happen later, to be known. My mysterious husband has secrets of his own. Me, I have my daydreams until they all come true. Other people's stories will do.
She makes the starlight shine, the perfect wife, not mine, the iridescent Isabel.